My name is Danny Mitchell, and I'm 28 years old. This story begins 3 months ago when I got the call that my grandfather, Earl Mitchell, had passed away at the age of 89. Grandpa Earl had been the cornerstone of our family, a tough old farmer who had worked his 400-acre spread in Iowa for over 60 years. I had always been Grandpa's favorite, though he never said it outright. While my Uncle Frank, his only son, had moved to the city and became a successful insurance salesman, I had stayed close to the farm. Every weekend since I was 12, I'd drive out from town to help Grandpa with whatever needed doing. We'd work on equipment, tend to the cattle, and he'd teach me everything about farming that couldn't be learned from books. The last time I saw Grandpa alive was 2 weeks before he died. He had called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual because he rarely used the phone unless it was important. His voice sounded weaker than usual, but his mind was still sharp as ever. "Danny, I need you to come out to the farm tomorrow. There's something important we need to discuss." When I arrived the next morning, I found him sitting in his workshop behind the barn, surrounded by the tools and machinery that had been his life's work. He looked frail in a way that scared me, but his eyes still held that familiar spark of determination. "Son, I'm not going to be around much longer," he said without preamble. "The doctors say I've got maybe a month, maybe less. There are things I need to tell you, things about the farm and about your Uncle Frank." We talked for 3 hours that day. Grandpa told me things about the family that I had never known, about debts that Frank had accumulated and money he had borrowed from Grandpa over the years. But most importantly, he told me about his plans for the farm after he was gone. "Frank's going to inherit everything according to the will," Grandpa said. "That's the way it has to be legally. But Danny, there's something else. Something that's going to be yours no matter what that will says." Chapter 2. The Funeral and the Will Reading. Grandpa's funeral was held on a cold February morning at the Methodist church in town. The entire farming community turned out to pay their respects to a man who had been a pillar of the agricultural community for decades. I served as one of the pallbearers, along with 5 other men who had known and respected Grandpa for most of their lives. Uncle Frank flew in from Chicago with his wife Margaret and their 2 teenage kids. I hadn't seen Frank in almost 2 years, and the distance between us felt like more than just geography. He wore an expensive black suit and seemed more concerned with checking his phone than with mourning his father. During the service, Pastor Williams spoke about Grandpa's dedication to the land and his community. He mentioned how Grandpa had always said that farming wasn't just a job, but a calling. As I listened to those words, I felt the weight of everything Grandpa had taught me over the years. After the burial, we gathered at the law office of Mr. Peterson, the family attorney, for the reading of the will. The office was small and cramped, with law books lining the walls and the smell of old paper and leather filling the air. Mr. Peterson, a man in his 70s who had known our family for decades, cleared his throat and began reading the formal language of Grandpa's last will and testament. As expected, everything went to Frank as the only surviving child. The farm, the house, all the equipment, the livestock, and the bank accounts. Everything totaled to just over $2 million. Frank tried to look appropriately solemn, but I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. He had just inherited a fortune, and he knew it. Margaret was already talking quietly about selling the farm and moving the money into better investments. "Is there anything else, Mr. Peterson?" Frank asked when the reading was finished. "No, that covers everything in the will," the lawyer replied. "Danny, I'm sorry there wasn't more for you. Your grandfather spoke of you often, and with great affection." I nodded and shook the lawyer's hand. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Grandpa gave me more than enough over the years." But as I walked out of that office, I was thinking about the conversation I'd had with Grandpa 2 weeks earlier, and the secret he had shared with me. Chapter 3. The Old Massey Ferguson. 3 days after the funeral, Frank called me with what he probably thought was generous news. "Danny, I know Grandpa was fond of you, and I want to do right by the family. I'm going to give you that old Massey Ferguson tractor that's been sitting in the back of the barn. It's not worth much, but I know you and Grandpa used to work on it together. The 1965 Massey Ferguson 135 had been Grandpa's first tractor, the one he'd bought when he was just starting out as a young farmer. It hadn't run in years and was covered in dust and rust, sitting forgotten in the corner of the barn behind newer, more valuable equipment. "That's very generous of you, Frank," I said, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. "I'd like that very much. Consider it a family heirloom Frank said magnanimously. "I'll have it towed to your place next week." What Frank didn't know was that this old tractor was exactly what Grandpa had been talking about during our last conversation. "Danny," he had said, "no matter what happens with the will, that old Massey Ferguson is yours. I've made sure of that. And when you get it, you remember what I taught you about taking care of things that are important." The following Tuesday, a flatbed truck delivered the old tractor to my small property on the outskirts of town. The driver helped me unload it into my garage, where I could work on it without interference from Frank or anyone else. That evening, I began the process that Grandpa had described to me. I started by removing the engine cover, something I had done dozens of times over the years when we were working on various repairs. But this time, I was looking for something specific. Hidden beneath the battery compartment, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed in a waterproof container, I found exactly what Grandpa had told me would be there. It was a manila envelope with my name written on it, in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. Inside the envelope was a letter from Grandpa, along with several legal documents that would change everything I thought I knew about the inheritance. Chapter 4. Grandpa's Secret Letter. I sat on an old milk crate in my garage, holding Grandpa's letter with hands that were shaking slightly. The fluorescent light overhead cast harsh shadows as I began to read the familiar handwriting that had filled so many birthday cards and Christmas notes over the years. "Danny, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've found what I left for you in the old Massey. I hope Frank was decent enough to let you have the tractor, but knowing him, he probably thinks he's being generous giving you something worthless." I had to smile at that. Grandpa had known his son well. The letter continued. "What Frank doesn't know is that this old tractor represents something much more valuable than he could ever imagine. You see, son, I've been planning for this day for a long time, ever since I realized what kind of man Frank had become." Grandpa went on to explain that over the past 10 years, Frank had borrowed significant amounts of money from him. Money for his business, for his house, for his kids' private school tuition. The total amount was over $400,000, all documented in promissory notes that Frank had signed. "I never intended to collect on those debts while I was alive," the letter explained. "Frank is my son, and family helps family. But I also knew that if I left you anything significant in my will, Frank would find a way to contest it or take it away from you. So I came up with a different plan." The documents in the envelope included all of Frank's promissory notes, along with a legal assignment transferring those debts to me. According to the paperwork, Frank now owed me $427,000 with interest that had been accumulating for years. But that wasn't all. There was also a deed showing that Grandpa had quietly transferred ownership of a 40-acre parcel of the farm to me 3 years earlier. It was the best farmland on the property, worth at least $300,000, and it had been legally mine for years without Frank's knowledge. "The beauty of this plan," Grandpa's letter concluded, "is that everything is completely legal and above board. Frank got his inheritance just like the will specified, but he also got his debts. And you got what you deserve for being the grandson who actually cared about this family and this land." I sat in that garage for over an hour, reading and rereading the documents, making sure I understood exactly what Grandpa had done. It was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. Chapter 5. Frank's Shock. I waited a week before contacting Frank, using that time to have all the documents reviewed by my own attorney. Everything was legitimate and legally binding. Grandpa had been meticulous in his planning, ensuring that every detail would hold up in court if necessary. When I finally called Frank, he was in the middle of making plans to sell the farm. He had already contacted a real estate agent and was talking to developers about subdividing the property for residential development. "Frank, we need to meet. There are some things about Grandpa's estate that we need to discuss." "What kind of things?" The will was pretty straightforward. "It's not about the will. It's about some other legal matters that Grandpa left behind. Can you meet me at the farm tomorrow afternoon?" Frank agreed, probably thinking I wanted to ask for some small keepsake or maybe discuss buying a piece of equipment. He had no idea what was coming. I arrived at the farm an hour early and walked through the fields that had been Grandpa's life's work. The 40 acres that were now legally mine were the prime farmland, the section that any buyer would want most. Without that parcel, the rest of the farm was significantly less valuable. Frank pulled up in his BMW right on time, dressed in casual clothes but still managing to look out of place on the farm where he had grown up. We met in the farmhouse kitchen, the same room where Grandpa had made countless decisions about the operation over the decades. "So what's this about, Danny?" I spread the documents out on the kitchen table, the promissory notes, the deed to the 40 acres, and Grandpa's letter explaining everything. Frank's face went through a series of expressions as he read through the papers. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of pale shock as the full implications became clear. "This can't be legal," he said finally. "Dad wouldn't have done this without telling me." "It's completely legal, Frank. I've had my attorney review everything. You owe me $427,000 plus accumulated interest, and that 40-acre section has been legally mine for 3 years. Frank was quiet for a long time, staring at the documents as if he could make them disappear through sheer force of will. Chapter 6. The confrontation. Frank's initial shock quickly turned to anger, and then to something approaching rage. He stood up from the kitchen table so quickly that his chair fell backward, clattering on the linoleum floor. "You manipulated him! You turned my father against me!" "Frank, I didn't manipulate anyone. These debts are real. You borrowed this money over the past 10 years, and the land transfer happened 3 years ago. Grandpa made these decisions on his own. But why didn't he tell me? Why all the secrecy?" I picked up Grandpa's letter and read him a section he had apparently missed. Frank has become the kind of man who sees dollar signs instead of family legacy. He would have fought any gift to Danny, would have contested any provision in the will. This way, Danny gets what he deserves, and Frank gets exactly what he earned. Frank began pacing around the kitchen, running his hands through his hair. "Do you have any idea what this does to my plans? I've already talked to developers. I've got buyers interested in the property. Well, you can't sell what you don't own, and that 40-acre section is the most valuable part of the farm." "How much?" Frank asked suddenly. "How much what? How much do you want for the land? And how much to forgive the debts?" I had been expecting this question, and I had already decided on my answer. "The land isn't for sale, Frank. As for the debts, you signed those promissory notes. You owe the money." Frank's face was getting red now. "Danny, be reasonable. We're family. Surely we can work something out." "We are family, Frank. That's why Grandpa loaned you the money in the first place." "But being family doesn't mean you don't have to pay your debts." "I don't have $400,000 in cash." "Then I guess you'll need to figure out how to get it." The truth was, I didn't really want to destroy Frank financially, but I also wasn't going to let him walk away from his responsibilities while trying to sell off the family farm for development. Chapter 7. Margaret's intervention. 2 days later, Frank's wife, Margaret, called me. I had always gotten along well with Margaret, and I could hear the stress in her voice when she asked if we could meet for coffee in town. We met at the small diner on Main Street, the same place where Grandpa used to have coffee with his farming friends every morning for decades. Margaret looked tired and worried, and she got straight to the point. "Danny, Frank told me about the documents you found. Is there any way we can work this out without destroying our family?" "Margaret, I'm not trying to destroy anything. I'm just asking Frank to honor the debts he signed for. But you know we don't have that kind of money. Frank's business is doing well, but not well enough to pay off $400,000 all at once." I had been thinking about this problem for days, and I had come up with what I thought was a fair solution. "Margaret, I don't need the money all at once. I'm willing to work out a payment plan, but there are conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "First, Frank stops trying to sell the farm for development. If he wants to sell it, it has to be to another farmer who will keep it as agricultural land. Second, he pays me $2,000 a month until the debt is satisfied. And third, he acknowledges that the 40 acres are mine and stops trying to include them in any sale." Margaret was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "That seems reasonable. But Danny, there's something else you should know. Frank has been talking about contesting this whole thing in court." "On what grounds?" "He thinks he can prove that your grandfather wasn't mentally competent when he made these decisions. He's been talking to lawyers about challenging the debt assignments and the land transfer." This was something I had been worried about. If Frank could convince a court that Grandpa had been suffering from dementia or had been unduly influenced, he might be able to void the documents. "Margaret, you knew Grandpa as well as anyone. Was he mentally competent 3 years ago when he transferred that land?" "Of course he was. He was sharp as a tack right up until the end. But Frank is desperate, Danny. He's already spent money he was counting on from selling the farm. I realized that Frank's desperation made him dangerous. A man facing financial ruin might do anything to protect himself, including dragging the family through a costly and bitter legal battle. Chapter 8. The legal battle begins. Frank made good on his threat to contest the documents in court. Within a week of our conversation, I received legal papers indicating that he was challenging both the debt assignments and the land transfer on grounds of mental incompetence and undue influence. The lawsuit alleged that I had manipulated Grandpa during his final years, taking advantage of his declining mental state to convince him to transfer assets to me. Frank's lawyers painted a picture of a scheming grandson who had isolated an elderly man from his family and convinced him to disinherit his own son. Reading those legal documents was like being punched in the stomach. The Frank I had grown up with, the uncle who had taught me to throw a baseball and had taken me fishing when I was young, was now publicly accusing me of elder abuse. I hired the best attorney I could afford, a woman named Sarah Chen who specialized in estate disputes. She reviewed all of Grandpa's documents and interviewed several people who had known him during his final years. Danny, the good news is that your grandfather was very thorough in documenting his mental competence, Sarah told me during our first meeting. He had regular medical checkups, and there's no evidence of dementia or cognitive decline. The bad news is that these cases can be expensive and time-consuming. How expensive? If this goes to trial, you could be looking at $50,000 or more in legal fees. And Frank probably knows that. He might be hoping you'll settle just to avoid the cost and stress of litigation. But I wasn't going to be intimidated. Grandpa had trusted me with his final wishes, and I wasn't going to let Frank's greed override that trust. The legal discovery process began, with both sides requesting documents and deposing witnesses. Frank's lawyers interviewed everyone who had known Grandpa, looking for any evidence that his mental state had been compromised. What they found instead was a consistent picture of a man who had been sharp, decisive, and very much in control of his faculties, right up until his death. Pastor Williams testified that Grandpa had been actively involved in church decisions until his final month. Dr. Harrison, his physician, testified that while Grandpa had been physically declining, his mind had remained clear. Most damaging to Frank's case was the testimony of Mr. Peterson, the family lawyer, who revealed that Grandpa had consulted with him multiple times about the debt assignments and land transfer, always demonstrating clear understanding of the legal implications. Chapter 9. The Smoking Gun. 3 months into the legal battle, Sarah made a discovery that would prove to be the turning point in our case. While reviewing Grandpa's financial records, she found something that Frank's lawyers had apparently missed. Danny, did you know that your grandfather had been secretly recording his conversations with Frank for the past 2 years? I was stunned. Recording them? Why? According to these notes, he was concerned about Frank's increasingly aggressive demands for money and his threats to put him in a nursing home if he didn't cooperate. Your grandfather was protecting himself. The recordings were stored on a digital device that Grandpa had hidden in his desk drawer. There were dozens of conversations, including several where Frank could be heard pressuring his father for money and making threats about his future care. In one particularly damaging recording from 6 months before Grandpa's death, Frank could be heard saying, "Dad, you're getting old and confused. Maybe it's time to think about letting me handle your finances. You don't want to make any mistakes that could hurt the family." In another recording, Frank explicitly threatened to move Grandpa to a nursing home if he didn't agree to loan him money for a business investment that had gone bad. These recordings completely destroy Frank's claim that he was a loving son looking out for his father's best interests, Sarah explained. They show a pattern of financial abuse and emotional manipulation. When Frank's lawyers heard about the recordings, they immediately requested a settlement conference. They knew that if these recordings were played in court, Frank's case would be destroyed, and he might even face criminal charges for elder abuse. The settlement conference was held in a neutral location, with both sides and their attorneys present. Frank looked haggard and defeated, a far cry from the confident man who had inherited a fortune just months earlier. "My client is prepared to acknowledge the validity of the debt assignments and the land transfer," Frank's lawyer announced. "In exchange, we're asking for a reasonable payment plan for the outstanding debts." It was essentially a complete surrender. Frank was admitting that everything Grandpa had done was legal and valid, and he was asking for mercy in terms of repayment. Chapter 10. Justice and Mercy. Looking across the conference table at Frank, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I had won the legal battle, but at the cost of destroying what was left of our family relationship. Frank was my uncle, and despite everything that had happened, I remembered the good times we had shared when I was younger. "I'm willing to discuss a settlement," I told the mediator. "But there are conditions that aren't negotiable." First, Frank had to publicly acknowledge that Grandpa had been mentally competent and that all the legal documents were valid. This would clear Grandpa's name and reputation from any suggestion that he had been manipulated or confused. Second, Frank had to agree to a payment plan for the debts that wouldn't bankrupt him, but would ensure that the money was eventually repaid. I proposed $1,500 per month for 20 years, which would cover the principal and a reasonable amount of interest. Third, Frank had to agree that the remaining farm property could only be sold to someone who would continue farming it, not to developers who would turn it into a subdivision. "And finally," I said, looking directly at Frank, "I want a written apology, not to me, but to Grandpa's memory. You accused him of being mentally incompetent and claimed that he was manipulated. Those accusations were false, and they dishonored a good man's memory." Frank's lawyer started to object, but Frank himself held up a hand to stop him. "Danny's right," he said quietly. "I was wrong about Dad. I was angry and desperate, and I said things that weren't true." The settlement was formalized within a week. Frank would pay me $1,500 per month for 20 years, and he acknowledged in writing that all of Grandpa's legal documents were valid and that Grandpa had been mentally competent when he made his decisions. The written apology was harder for Frank to write, but he eventually produced a letter that acknowledged his father's mental competence and expressed regret for the accusations he had made. With the legal battle over, I finally felt like I could properly grieve for Grandpa and begin to move forward with my life. Chapter 11. Restoring the Massey Ferguson. With the legal issues resolved, I turned my attention back to the old Massey Ferguson tractor that had started this whole journey. The irony wasn't lost on me that Frank had given me the tractor thinking it was worthless, when in reality, it had been the key to uncovering Grandpa's master plan. I spent the next several months completely restoring the old tractor. It became a labor of love, a way to honor Grandpa's memory while also creating something beautiful from something that had been forgotten and neglected. Every evening after work, I would spend hours in my garage, carefully disassembling, cleaning, and rebuilding every component of the 1965 Massey Ferguson. I replaced the engine, rebuilt the transmission, and restored the hydraulic system. The faded red paint was stripped down to bare metal and repainted in the original Massey Ferguson red. As I worked on the tractor, I thought about all the lessons Grandpa had taught me over the years. He had always said that anything worth having was worth taking care of and that you could tell a lot about a person by how they treated their tools and equipment. The restoration took 6 months, but when it was finished, the old Massey Ferguson looked better than it had when it rolled off the assembly line in 1965. More importantly, it ran perfectly, purring like a contented cat when I started it up for the first time. I decided to enter the restored tractor in the county fair's antique tractor show. It was something Grandpa would have loved, and I wanted to share his memory with the community that had known and respected him. The tractor won first place in its category, and several people who had known Grandpa came up to tell me stories about the old days when he had used that same tractor to work his fields. It was a fitting tribute to a man who had loved the land and the machines that helped him work it. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that I had preserved something important, something that connected me to Grandpa and to the farming heritage that he had passed down to me. Chapter 12. A New Beginning. With the settlement money coming in regularly from Frank, I was able to make some significant changes in my life. I quit my job at the grain elevator and decided to try farming the 40 acres that Grandpa had left me. It was a big risk. 40 acres wasn't enough to make a living from farming alone, but it was enough to get started. I used some of the settlement money to buy used equipment and to prepare the land for planting. The first year was challenging. I had a lot to learn about the business side of farming, and there were times when I wondered if I had made a mistake. But every time I drove the restored Massey Ferguson across those fields, I felt connected to something larger than myself. I also started a small side business restoring antique tractors for other collectors and farmers. Word spread about the quality of my work, and soon I had more projects than I could handle. It was satisfying work that combined my mechanical skills with my love of agricultural history. Frank and I slowly began to rebuild our relationship. The monthly payments were a constant reminder of what had happened, but they also represented a kind of accountability that seemed to be good for both of us. Frank had learned some hard lessons about family and responsibility, and I had learned about the importance of standing up for what's right. Margaret would call me occasionally to update me on their family, and to let me know how Frank was doing. The financial pressure had actually been good for him in some ways, forcing him to focus on his business and to live more modestly than he had before. "He's a different person now," Margaret told me during one of our conversations. "More humble, more appreciative of what he has. I think your grandfather's plan worked better than anyone could have expected." The 40 acres were producing well, and I was starting to think about expanding the operation. There were neighboring farms that might come up for sale, and I was building the financial foundation that would allow me to grow. Chapter 13. Legacy. 2 years after Grandpa's death, I was driving the restored Massey Ferguson across my fields during spring planting, when I realized that his plan had worked perfectly. Not just the legal and financial aspects, but the deeper purpose behind everything he had done. Grandpa had wanted to ensure that the family's agricultural heritage would continue, and that someone who truly understood and appreciated farming would carry on the tradition. By giving me the land and the means to farm it, he had accomplished exactly that. Frank had inherited the bulk of the estate, as was appropriate for the eldest son, but he had also inherited the responsibility that came with it. The monthly payments to me were teaching him about accountability and the real cost of his past behavior. Most importantly, Grandpa had found a way to bring justice to a situation that could have been deeply unfair. Without his intervention, Frank would have sold the farm for development, and I would have received nothing despite my years of dedication to the family and the land. The old Massey Ferguson had become a symbol of everything Grandpa had taught me about perseverance, craftsmanship, and the importance of taking care of things that matter. Every time I started it up, I could almost hear his voice reminding me to check the oil, grease the fittings, and treat the machine with respect. I had also learned something important about family. Blood relationships don't automatically entitle anyone to respect or inheritance. Those things have to be earned through actions, through loyalty, and through understanding what really matters. Frank had learned that lesson the hard way, but he had learned it. Our relationship would never be the same as it was when I was a child, but it was honest now in a way it had never been before. As I finished planting that spring day, I thought about the future. The farm was growing, my restoration business was thriving, and I was building something that would honor Grandpa's memory and continue his legacy. The old Massey Ferguson had indeed been mine, just as Grandpa had promised. But more than that, it had been the key to unlocking a future that honored the past while building something new and meaningful. Grandpa had been right about so many things, but he had been especially right about this. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, but the wisdom to know what's truly worth fighting for. Thank you for listening to this story about family, inheritance, and the power of justice. I hope it reminded you that sometimes the smallest things can hold the greatest value, and that doing what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Please take a moment to write in the comments below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. We love connecting with our global audience. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more real-life tales that will inspire and move you. Until next time, remember that the most important inheritance we can leave behind is the example of how we lived our lives.